and welcome to the Tim 100 conversation being held in the sunny rural metropolis of Owen Sound, located in northern southwestern Ontario. My name is James, and I am, of course, here to welcome you and to remind you that you are awesome. We also have this crazy idea that if we can get 10 businesses together, built up around 100 different members, all with us bringing our membership dues of $100 a month, using that to turn to become the pool of capital that we can then turn uh, those 10 businesses into realities with. That's the basic idea behind the 10-100. And that's the idea that I'm trying to propose that we galvanize around here in Owen Sound and in the greater Owen Sound area. I think this is an idea that can affect the entire Great Bruce, really. We often refer to the Bruce Peninsula as a whole, even though encompasses, equal parts gray. No, actually, we'll have to say that it encompasses a lot of Bruce County, so we'll give you that, Bruce. Um, but I definitely feel and see myself as a part of this landscape, a part of this world, and I want to give back. I want to be a part of this community in a way that produces life, for lack of a better term. Um, I'm also trying to recover from burnout, as I was once going to be a church planter and or a missionary for the evangelical world. I cannot do that for reasons that should be obvious to everybody involved, and I sitting here in my attic trying to figure out what the next step in life is for me. I tried to figure out what I can use my uh, different levels of expertise in order uh, to apply. And part of that is building community. Part of that is casting vision for people to galvanize around. So, with that being said, the 10-100 idea again is, and I'm always going to go over this again and again, and I know it gets annoying, and part of it is because it's still an idea in progress. Every time I repeat the idea, it is hammering it out just a little bit more. And what I want to do, and where I feel like we're in that transitionary stage right now, and the metaphor of driving in a standard vehicle comes to mind, where you have to match the clutch of the vehicle with the gears that you're in, and letting the clutch out while you're going from one gear into another, um, and allowing it to just hit that moment where there's like that, where it takes hold. You can stall the vehicle if you're not careful. And one of the things I do not want to do is to stall this project. But at the same time, I find myself continuously at places where I'm asking questions that I'm at a limit to answer within my own imagination, and also within my own ability to read and understand the laws as they appear. So I absolutely am reaching out to the greater community, certainly out of a place of ignorance, but also a place of curiosity, because I want to learn. I want to get better at understanding these things, and I want to share that journey with everybody as I go along. So, with that in mind, it seems to me that right at the moment, in the aftermath of, well, I would love to say aftermath, but it seems to me that that's probably premature. We're in the middle of a pandemic. COVID-19 is a very real concern. This morning, I learned that a friend of mine uh, learned that their people that were close to them were diagnosed with COVID-19. I mean, that's two, maybe three people separated from me. I don't even know their names, but I know the name of the person who they mean a lot to, and I'm now affected. It's only a matter of time before that starts happening to all of us. And that's going to have a very, dour effect on, one's outlook on life. We've been through this before with the so-called Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, and it lasted a while. We got through it, and it's my sincere hope that we'll learn the lessons from the past, and we'll take them, we'll apply them to ourselves, And we'll get through this one as well, of course. That was before, you know, there's been a lot of rioting down south. There's been a lot of people gathering together in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they do. I was chatting about this with a friend of mine, about where is our place to lend our opinion, to lend our thoughts onto this, living in what I jokingly refer to as a rural metropolis here in Owen Sound. Interestingly enough, often advertised as the last stop on the Underground Railroad. Um, and indeed, we do have the old British Episcopalian Methodist Church, which historically was the church that was made up of freed slaves who ended up in our part of the world. Um, by and large, that's the extent of our community's claim to progressive values, as far as I'm aware. And that's over 100 years ago. And in a time of this unrest, I just got to say, I'm with the Black Lives Matter people. And I just want to take a moment to not give my opinion, to not give my thoughts on, you know, what should happen, but just take a moment of silence. So I'm gonna do that. I just wanted to say that, George Floyd was somebody whose name I should never have known. There's really no way my circle would ever overlap with anyone in Minneapolis, let alone George Floyd. But his is a name that has galvanized us all. And I wanted to inspire me to become better, to become part of the solution, not be a part of the problem. I don't know what that means for me, living in the rural metropolis of Owen Sound. But we'll figure it out. And when we do, and as we do, and as we learn from those who have something to say, as we listen to the idle no more people, and learn what they have to teach us about reality here in the Bruce Peninsula, in the Grey Bruce, Owen Sound, and surrounding. And as we figure it out, hopefully we're going to figure it out to something that is better for everybody involved. Which brings me back to the idea of the 10-100. Real briefly, 10 businesses, 100 people. That's where it all starts. As it breaks down, the idea always evolves around the idea that we have multiple small to medium-sized businesses. Some will be larger than others. Some will be made up of a small contingent, maybe 4 or 5 people. Ideally, we would have an average of 8 people dedicated to each business. Of that 8 people, one of them will be the business visionary. One of them will be the person who will be elected to be the manager of that business. To me, it makes sense that that would be the person with the business vision. And it would make sense that they would be given a certain amount of time within the budget for the proposed business. So every business visionary would propose, a business plan based on the criteria that we have set within the 10-100. We need to know what the expected labor costs are going to be, how many people are going to be needed to be on deck at any given time in order for this to work. What kind of supplies do you need? What kind of materials do you need? What kind of tools do you need? Do you need a shop? Do you need machines? What kind of insurance do you require? Do we require specialized training? Okay, all these things cost money, not a problem. We just need to know what that budget is. We figure out what that budget is, and then our pool of capital, the membership fees that we collect every month, will eventually be given to the businesses on a sequential basis. So we have 10 businesses proposed, and of these 10 businesses that are proposed, the 100 members, again, ratify these businesses. So all 100 members basically sign off saying, yep, these are the 10 businesses that I will support. I'm okay with my $100 a month going to financing the startup of these 10 businesses. Cool. Also, as a member, you will be dedicating yourself to one of these businesses, and that basically means that as a member, that business can call upon you to fulfill shifts that are required. So you are the first line of labor resource for these businesses, and so when the manager, creates the shifts and posts them as a member, of a dedicated business, or you would get notified of the shifts available I should say. You would be made aware of the shifts that are available for your primary business, the one that you are dedicated to, and it would go round robin. Possibly there might be a seniority scheme in place. People who have worked at that particular business for longer hours, might have a rule to be able to claim that they can have access to the more preferred shifts if there are such a thing. I know that when I used to work for a call center, we used to do a shift bidding scenario that was based on seniority, which was based on the amount of hours worked. So if you had somebody who had a relatively low employee number, like I did, generally speaking, you could, because I had a low employee number, it means that I had been working at the company longer than people who had a higher employee number. So it was usually a good indication that you could figure out whether or not you would like win a shift that you were bidding for the quarter, based on your employee number. But not always, because as time went on, sometimes there would be a lot of work, so there would be a lot of overtime offered. So people who had come in a little bit later would get opportunity to catch up on hours. And some of us who particularly hated working in a call center, um, uh, would take advantage of low periods of work when they would allow people to go home. And so, even though I would have started earlier and had more hours, eventually you would get people who had employee numbers which were, hesitate to say higher in rank, but had not quite much as in seniority, would eventually get to the point where they were beating me for shifts because they were eager beavers, I guess, and they liked the overtime. Um, and me, I could take her to leave it. I preferred my freedom. And all that to say, I am still teasing out how that would work within the 10100 when you have a series of dedicated employees that they become not employees, dedicated members. Can you tell I've grown up in a capitalist system? So we have our dedicated members who are become the first tier of people who will become the laborers for the business as um, as the business gets up and running, gets up and going. We had somebody join the Facebook group here recently who proposed that a business that we might do would involve something along the lines of urban gardening, with the purposes of growing vegetables, produce, and then taking that produce to market and then splitting the proceeds of what the market or what the produce produced at the market with the people whose lawn was given in order to produce the produce. This is going to get confusing. And I thought that was a particularly neat idea. And something that we could absolutely work with here in the Owen Sound area. We have a lot of people with a lot of green space and a lot of lawns, and a lot of people who might not necessarily want to join the 10100 to become member laborers, but might want to join a 10100 gardening movement that all they have to do is sign on the dotted line that says, yes, the 10100 group can come and install and till my land, my backyard. They will work with me, with their experts, to and we would have a plan. And at this point, I'm spitballing, so we get to do anything from we can have a bunch of rototillers and till up people's backyards and grow produce, grow things in town, and then bring those to market and sell them there. Contract with local businesses, local restaurants, apply those, and then we would just have various members of the 10100 whose job it would be to go around a couple of hours a week. They would have their locations and just water, take care of stuff, weed, make sure that everything is growing right. So if you are a member of the 10100 and you have a green thumb and you want to get a couple of extra hours in this week, what better way to do so than to take up a shift or two? And remember, a shift within the 10100 is 4 hours. So, and in addition to having the traditional consecutive shift where you work 8 hours in a row. We also have room for non-consecutive hour shifts. So you'll get paid for 8 hours of work. But when you do those 8 hours is up to you, essentially. All we care is that that work gets done. And so in a situation like this, having non-consecutive hours that you can fill in, so over the 8 hours of the course of your work week, you will be expected to, in between other things that you're doing during the rest of your day, to go water plants, weed, and when time comes to put maybe a couple of extra hours into harvesting, and maybe putting in a shift on a weekend once a month, selling at the farmer's market. That sort of idea. Either way, you would be getting paid for that, and so long as the work's getting done, um, when you do those things, entirely up to you. You just tell us that you did it, log it on using our app, our that we're going to be developing for organizing the 10100, and from there, we keep track of it all. And the way this would, of course, work is we would, within the 10100, let's say that this becomes the business that, one of the businesses that we are going to start up. Cool. So we've figured out what the starting budget for this is. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the numbers available to me. We would have to incorporate somebody like, well, the person who brought this idea up in the first place. But there's going to be a certain amount of startup in here. At the very least, we're going to have to buy seed. We're going to have to buy tools. We're going to have to buy insurance. We're going to have to, if people don't already have a vehicle, we're going to have to rent vehicles, or we're going to have to lease them. Um, uh, these are the sorts of things we don't necessarily like. Or we're going to need to have a. I was going to say we don't necessarily need a physical building as the base of operations, but I mean, probably kind of do. Uh, And that's the sort of thing that, again, I don't have any expertise in this particular idea, but I would love to be able to have this conversation with people who do. And to tease that out, either way, the 10100, once we figured it out in terms of the startup budget, how much do we need to buy the seed? How much do we need to buy the tools? How many hours a week once we build, let's say we do raised beds, that seems to be a big deal, a big thing. So we build raised beds, we fill it with soil that we get from somewhere. So we have to figure out what that cost is. And then we plant it and we water it. Maybe we can have some sort of automatic irrigation system we can invest in that we can look after, so that it's just a matter of once it's all set up, we only need one or two people to kind of maintain the maintenance and do weeding, or maybe a couple more. Like that becomes a side job that we have. Maybe 6 or 7 people all doing 8 hours a week in between other jobs that they're doing, getting paid $20 an hour for watering and planting and gardening and all that other good stuff. But then we have to figure out, can we make it work in terms of the money and stuff. So then we need to cost it all out, and for that we definitely need to get somebody who has a little bit more expertise in terms of um, um, well, costing out what wholesale produce looks like, especially in the local area. So, and again, if all things being going according to plan, we will have members within the 10100 who will have that kind of expertise to lend to this enterprise in order to be able to facilitate that idea. So, because you remember I mentioned before, we have 10 businesses, and of those 10 businesses, on average, it would have 8 people. Well, anybody can do math says, hey, James, that leaves you with, if you have 10 businesses with 8 people in that, and you have 100 members, what are the other 20 people going to be doing? Fair question, I say. And to my mind, they would comprise the administration of the overall cooperative enterprise. They would be corporate, I guess you could say. They become the accounting department, they become the tax department, they become whatever the cooperative equivalent of human resources is, um, which I guess is like member development, you know. Uh, uh, the marketing department, rather than having individual marketing for each individual, each business, we'll just have a shared marketing department that each business can access. It just makes sense. That way, we can have a number of artists or graphic artists or people whose expertise are lay in advertising, marketing, that sort of thing, um, who we can afford to have them on staff, and heck, maybe to help supplement their income, they can put in a couple of part-time hours watering plants. Who can say? Uh, we'd have accountants. Like I mentioned that before. Bookkeeping. One of the things that is really annoying if you're a business owner is, are we in compliance with the law? It'd be really awesome if we had a team of people that just you could just call up and say, "Hey, we want to do this. Can we?" And they can say, "Yep, we can do that." Or, "Yeah, okay, hold on. We're going to need to get some insurance for that. We need to budget that out. So let's put it in for the next quarter, and we'll make it happen." Or, where are you guys at with your current incomes? Are you meeting and exceeding your quarterly budget aiming for this particular quarter? If the answer is yes, well, maybe we can work out something now. Let's see. And so the point of the matter is that we would have the people on hand that would be able to very quickly answer that, because that's their job, and they get paid for their expertise. So they would be a part of the 20. In terms of all that. Obviously, uh, when we begin, we will have one business that's exists to make money. Hopefully, it'll make a lot of money, and it'll make a lot of money, relatively on a relatively quick basis. So low turnover, or low turnaround, I should say. Um, some sort of retail thing comes to mind, something that just moves stuff quickly. That's one possibility. Of course, that having been said, that's a line of reasoning that was in my mind pre-COVID-19, so I might have to revisit that in the new world, and wonder what is it that people in this day of social isolation, what is it that people are looking for, and need, and how can we provide what people need? If we can figure out the most efficient and the best way to answer that, and use that as a way to fill our sales, I think we should do that. But back to the 100 idea, and how it would incorporate this idea uh, of doing gardening for producing produce in people's yards, instead of the yards being places full of grass, and a place that you have to you feel socially obligated to feel free of dandelions and to mow on a regular basis. Instead of having something like that, people are very intrigued by the idea of utilizing their what space they do have for gardening, and I love that idea too. So having a bunch of members within the 10100 who are like, this is our business. Okay, great. So we've already established we've got the starting. cool. Starting budget. So we've got all the tools. We figured out how much it costs in terms of lumber and soil and all that other great stuff. And the 10100 has fronted the money, and it was a lot of money for startup, and but that's okay. Because we're gonna get it back when we grow and we sell the stuff at market and stuff, or to local restaurants, and we're going to figure out how much produce we can expect to grow, and we're going to include members who are good at this sort of thing. So, and that's the whole idea. So, when you have uh, a member who has a business idea, the point will or they will then be encouraged to say, okay, who are the people that you want to do this with, because they are then going to become the core members of the business that you're going to be running, and they are going to be the ones that are going to be the dedicated members of your business. So figure out how many people you need to do this if it was up and running and successful. You know what I'm saying? Not necessarily starting tiny and growing big. We are going to invest in this in a way where we can hit the ground running, so we can hopefully break even sooner rather than later. And we're going to do that with a little bit of a larger investment than an individual could ever expect to muster up themselves, unless, of course, they were inheritors of some large wealth, or uh, won the lottery. It's the only way I can figure out that people are ever in a position to be able to start something like this. Else you start so small, and you just hope that you can gain enough traction by word of mouth and by friends referring friends, until finally you become established in the community. You've survived long enough, and that is incredibly difficult. I've seen more than one or two friends die on the entrepreneurial battlefield, just because not that their work was bad, but because when you're small, people can say, I'm not going to pay you. And you can say, but we have a contract. And it was like, take me to court. And they'll win because you can't afford to go to court. Or even if you can go to court, that's time away from, that's time away from your business, So when do you do that? At their whim? Like, it's horrible. Having something like a 10100 behind you, something with maybe a lawyer on staff, somebody who with a nice suit and tie and a very intimidating handshake and a nice little you will do this, or we will see you in court and we will get our money, sort of thing, avoids that sort of pitfall where you run into unscrupulous customers who will not pay if they can get away with it. Donald Trump, as much as we like to think of him as an enigma, he's not. There are a lot of people in this world who get ahead by stepping on others. And part of why we want to do the 10100, obviously, is because we want to do things a different way. But we still got to recognize that there will be people who will try to take advantage of us. And part of the reason why the 10100 is so useful is that there is power in numbers. There is power in safety and community. There's power in us sticking together to saying, hey, you can't take advantage of us. We did a good job. We did good work. We are worthy of our hire. And now, here's the bill. And you will pay. And so, that's a little bunny trail. Probably doesn't have a whole lot to do with a lot of stuff. But again, I guess bringing it back to the idea uh, of what we were going to do with the um, producing produce, I should say. And I really wish I had someone to talk to right at the moment, because I often find that when I have human beings to bounce these ideas off of, it generates excitement and energy within me. And I can latch onto that. One of the other reasons why, and this might be a good time to talk about it, seeing as it's something that I'm experiencing right now, one of the things, one of my reasons why I want to see the TIM 100 come into existence is because I want to see a work environment that is benefits people who have mental health issues. I do have mental health issues. It affects me from time to time, where I will just hit a wall. It's a side effect of complex trauma. It's a side effect of some of the medication I take to help with that. And there's unfortunately just not a whole lot I can do when I hit those walls. And in a traditional capitalist environment, um, there's not a whole lot of room for people who all of a sudden have to gap and pause. That costs the business money. And what that really means is that costs the business profit. And when your primary goal is to maximize shareholder value, that means that worker then becomes a liability, and efficiencies become the hallmark of what happens when, people like me get let go. Well, I want to create something that understands that sometimes people pause, and that's okay. Give them 5 minutes, they'll be able to get going again. And the business exists to allow that person to be able to exist, not the other way around. I don't exist to allow the business to continue to make money to maximize shareholder value. The business that I'm trying to grow with the TIM 100 exists to give me something to do, to help me pay my bills, to help me pay my mortgage. Hell, to get to a point where I don't have to pay my mortgage anymore. In fact, none of us will have to pay our mortgage anymore, because instead of pocketing all the cash that a fully operational TIM 100 will be producing, we'll be reinvesting that into housing. We'll be reinvesting that into education. We'll be reinvesting that back into our community through civil projects that we just turn our surplus into, because we can. Because we want to create the communities that we want to be a part of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To get there, we got to come up with businesses like the turning people's lawns, backyards into produce producing productive places that we can then share back with them. I believe the number that was given was they got 10% of what was produced, and then the rest went back into the cooperative, into their cooperative in the example. In ours, it'd be very interesting to figure out what the upfront costs are, work that in, and because if we get repeat people, then we can just continue to reuse the things that we installed in the previous spring. We can just reuse them after, the following winter. We can, the following spring. And which means we don't have to invest anywhere near as much money into growth. So there might be a way of doing this. We're saying, hey, we're going to be doing this. We need you to sign up for a minimum of 3 years, that sort of thing. And then we can, based on that calculation, of like guaranteeing that we'll have 3 years with at the very least that we can grow. Um, and then that gives us a basis to figure out at what point do we break even? At what point does the money that the TEN 100 invested in the first place, at what point is that money then covered? Um, and do we give people 10% of uh, oh, I wish I had more people here. Because now I'm getting into the point where I'm going to be start asking questions that I don't have answers to, and as I seem to recall, that's a bit of a faux pas if you want to give people the impression that you know what you're talking about. Um, and perhaps this will be a good spring point for people to engage in discussion on the website. So if you are watching this and you are part of the Grey Roost 10100 group, I would like to invite you now to go onto our group, and where I will have, hopefully by this point in time that you are watching this, have created a discussion inviting people to explore um, what this business could operate like or look like. I've given some ideas, in that based on the idea that you would have um, that this business would be to go around to ask individuals to donate, or not donate, but to allow us to contract with them to utilize their front lawn space or backyard space, or maybe in some rare cases uh, roof space, in order to create crops, in order to create plants, in order to create um, produce that we would then turn around and sell. So we would need people who would either go around to local restaurants to contract to sell a certain amount of produce, fresh produce, at various times during the year. We can possibly do that. So we would need members who would be members of the TEN 100 who would be good at that sort of thing, who would then take up a couple of hours, or a shift or two a week, whose job it would then be to go and set up those sales contracts, those build those bridges, and basically make us money. Um, and if you only need to set those up, a couple of times a year, um, excellent. We're going to make sure you're recompensed for that. And there might be a really interesting way of incentivizing pips based on return. So for members of sales who are able to create contracts between the TEN 100 and like say a restaurant, or say a grocery store, a retailer outlet, if we could negotiate a contract with them that ends up producing a surplus for the TEN 100, I have absolutely no problem allowing the person who negotiated that surplus to earn a a dividend share based on that, and perhaps multiple dividend shares based on that, based on um, uh, the returns there. It's something we would have to explore. Absolutely, nothing is set in stone, and still early days yet. Still a lot of thoughts to have. Very interested in this idea, line of thinking, and I'm very interested in other people's line of thinking as well. So I look forward to seeing some of this discussion on the website. Now, we have reached a point in time where I am going to now start reading from the book that we have been reading from, which of course is Humanizing the Economy. Cooperatives in the Age of Capital, I should say, by John Ristakis. And I have been finding this book incredibly helpful. It's not a textbook, which is much to my chagrin, as I adore textbooks. Give me the how-to manual, and I am happy. This is not so much a how-to manual as it is how they did it manual, as and how they are doing it manual. This is a narrative nonfiction. It's quite lovely. I'm not even too sure if that's a correct genre. It just seems to me that John is particularly adept at telling the stories of the people who uh, had very similar ideas to the 10100, to cooperative, and who added to the cooperative movement. As you can tell, I'm only this far into the book, and it is quite amazing. Um, I am going to now. Last week, as we went through the book, I got through the first part up to Homo economicus. So today, I'm going to pick up where I left off, and I am going to just be backing up from where I started before, and so starting a couple of paragraphs back. This is Chapter 1, The Grand Illusion. Page 11. Today, with global economic recession working its way like a virus through national economies, it seems hardly credible that such a view may have been taken seriously. That view, of course, being of the free market myth. But in truth, it was only those who were already spellbound by the free market myth that were already seduced. For just like the free market they believed in, the prophets and pundits of this brave new world seemed to inhabit a world of their own devising, a world apart. No amount of evidence to the contrary could shake their faith. One could point to the growing disparities of wealth at home and abroad. One could cite the declining conditions of work, health, education, and social welfare that plague the very countries that follow the neoliberal prescription. The obscene concentrations of power and money that were the predictable result of privatizing public assets in already impoverished nations were plain to see. None of this mattered. Always it was dismissed as the harsh medicine that preceded the remaking of economies in the free market mold. As in all ideologies, the effects on actual people were secondary. What mattered was the advancement of the free market model. And if some became very, very wealthy in the process, while others searched through heaps of rubbish for food, well, this was further evidence of the bounty for all that lay ahead. The dogged alliance of the free market faithful bore all the marks of a religious fervor: blind faith, supreme self-confidence, imperviousness to evidence, hostility to opposing views. Economics has, at the opening of the millennium, acquired the traits of a secular religion, a religion perfectly suited to a material age. Of course, there is a long backstory to this tale. The rise of the free market myth that has enthralled so many politicians, policymakers, academics, and a great swath of the public in Western democracy owes its origins to the early 18th century and the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Here there arose a school of economic thought deeply influenced by the mechanistic model of the universe embodied in Newtonian physics and all utilitarianism, a philosophy in which the individual came to be regarded not as an integral part of a society as a whole, but as an isolated social atom struggling with impersonal and unchanging market forces. Utilitarianism, the repressive doctrine of submission, and work that defined Methodism, worked together to forge the reigning ideology of the Industrial Revolution. Homo economicus. In the view of Jeremy Bentham, the founder of this philosophy, the human individual is an egotistical, selfish, competitive being whose sole criterion for action is the maximization of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. All human motives are traceable to this impulse, and its expression in the marketplace is the definition of rational choice. This is what economicists mean when they speak of maximizing one's utility. Indeed, all true social interaction takes place only in the marketplace. In this view of utilitarianism, social life considered as a collectivity, I should say, embodied in community, social classes, mutual aid societies, trade unions, or the myriad other forms of social association, are simply discounted. It was as if Jeremy Bentham had first asked himself, what type of human personality and human society is most conducive to or conducive, I should say, to the psychological and material needs of the industrial capitalism? And then proceeded to ascribe Homo economicus of classical economics precisely those attributes. The other influence that helped shape the philosophical temper of the emerging economics of the was the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes's deeply pessimistic view of human nature as essentially bestial, an aggressive, self-aggrandizing impulse that reduced the human community to, quote, a war against all. A war of each against all. Bentham at least meant well. He believed his philosophy would result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This sounds very good, but in practice this means that actions are judged solely from the standpoint of their effects. The problem is that it is impossible to know what the effects of certain actions might be. What seems good in the present may turn out to be catastrophic in the long run. The practice of utilitarianism also allows the ends to justify the means. It instrumentalizes human beings. The untold suffering that was visited on people during the Industrial Revolution was justified in exactly the same manner as free market ideology. Indeed, all ideology, whether we speak of communism on the left or fascism on the right, justifies the pain that is inflicted today for the sake of progress in the future, however that may be defined. Consider only the inhuman sacrifices exacted in the name of the socialist revolution. In his time, Bentham was a tireless advocate for political and social reform, a voice for universal education and women's rights, an opponent of the death penalty, and a supporter of early socialist experiments, including the cooperative communities of Robert Owen. Bentham passed on to posterity not only a hugely influential moral philosophy, but also, on a more material plane, his own preserved body, which may still be viewed perched inside a case of his own design at University College of London. That such a one-sided and impoverished conception of human nature should find such readily acceptance among economic theorists is itself cause for reflection. But its ultimate triumph as the cornerstone of conventional economic theory has provided intellectual cover to a revolutionary process of social engineering that succeeded in fundamentally changing both our notion of what it means to be human and the ways in which human life is lived. Acceptance of such a view outside the lecture hall and the boardroom has not been smooth, however. Its catastrophic effects on society and on the security and sustenance of the individual and the community were bitterly contested from the start. In the 19th century, there was a lively interest in cooperative theories of economics that blended social with economic values. William Thomson, perhaps the foremost intellectual figure of early socialism, formulated a political economy of cooperative socialism that provided a scathing critique of the capitalism of his day and a very different view of utilitarianism from that taught by Bentham. We shall have occasion to examine Thomson's seminal influence in the more detail in the following chapter. But the victory of economic man, as viewed by Bentham and Hobbes, was hard won by its advocates through a blend of brute force and a constant, unrelenting assault both on the public mind and on the more humane ideas of economics that vied with this view. During the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, a stirring repression of both political and economic freedoms was the government's primary means of enforcing the privileges of laissez-faire for the proprietary class, or propertied class, I should say. The Combinations Act of 1799-1800 made it a capital offense for workers to organize. Trade unionism and the movement for political reform were driven underground, and in the early 1800s, the overwhelming majority of executions in the United Kingdom were for crimes against property. Naturally enough, it was those who had the most to gain from such a view that did their most to propagate it. Thompson himself made this same point in his own day. In the United States, the current epicenter of free market ideology, the transition from a deeply conservative, frugal, agrarian Protestantism in which community life and the values of thrift and mutual help had deep roots, to a culture of compulsive, individualistic consumption was slow, over a century in the making. Severing the social dimension of economics, and including the role of public institutions such as government, from the supposed pure operations of commerce violated both common sense and the traditional operations of market economies since their inception in the 14th century. The role of collective interests, the public good, in regulating the operation of markets has never been questioned until the advent of the Industrial Revolution in England. It was here that the notion of the autonomous economy was first articulated as corollary to the society transformations attending industrialization and the growing influence of capital. And it was here, too, that the traditional relations between markets on one hand and the underlying economics organization of society on the other were entirely recast. In the past, markets were closely monitored and controlled by social and political forces that acted to protect what was conceived as public interest from the negative effects of market forces. The meticulous management of markets was thus a familiar feature of medieval city life. State regulation and local custom combined to protect the public interest. In local trade, there was careful regulation of food supplies through the transparency of transactions. Middlemen were strictly prohibited in order to protect the populace against the inflation of prices. Later, when the state played a central role in the development of internal markets between cities, the social interest was again paramount in the control of the competition to avoid the emergence of monopolies. It was well understood that unrestricted competition leads to monopoly, a truth that seems lost on conventional economic thinking. Indeed, this conception of market forces operating within recognized social and moral limits persisted well into the 18th century. During the late 1700s in England, there were regular outbreaks of riots when food prices transgressed these limits, as noted by E. P. Thompson. In The Popular Mind, the prevalence of what he termed a quote, moral economy still governed the rules of the marketplace. People expected to buy their provisions in the open market, and even in times of shortage, they expected prices to be regulated by custom. Here is John Wesley's contemporary account of what happened in Jamestown, Ireland, when this custom was violated. The mob had been in motion all that day, but their business was only with the forestallers of the market, who had bought up all the corn far and near to starve the poor, and load a Dutch ship which lay at the quay. But the mob brought it all out into the market and sold it for the owners at the common price, and they did this with all the calmness and composure imaginable, and without striking or hurting anyone. Similarly, in Honorington in 1766, lace workers seized corn on the premises of the farmers, took it to the market themselves, sold it, and returned the money and even the sacks back to the farmers. Economic systems that preceded the Industrial Revolution were inseparable from the broader realities of social relations, and the regulation of markets was essential for the delicate balance between commerce and the social systems that surrounded it. The same principle held true for primitive economies. The primacy of social relations and the individual's identity as a social being was the basis of human society and the economic systems that sustained it. The conduct of economics as the conduct of economics as an expression of social values was also an integral part of the civic humanism that was epitomized in the great urban cultures of central Italy at the dawn of the Renaissance era. Three principles stand out in this conception of urban civilization. The social identity of the individual is expressed in the notion of citizenship, the sovereignty of the people in a free society, and the orientation of economic activity to the common good, which alone justifies it. It was this humanistic view of economics as a social good that was supplanted by the Industrial Revolution and the utilitarianism philosophy of Bentham that was its intellectual expression. Contrary to the common view that modern market society grew out of humankind's natural propensity to barter and engage in commercial exchange for profit, the organizing principles for economic systems right up to the advent of the Industrial Revolution were reciprocity, redistribution, and family based farming, or some combination of the three. In this framework, the orderly production, the distribution of goods was secured by a wide range of personal motives that were guided by well established rules of social conduct. The profit motive was not prominent among them. This is not to say that there was not a class of individuals that pursued gain just as avidly as businessmen do today. Iris Origio, illuminated study of merchant life in the 14th century Italy, makes this clear. Her protagonist, the Prato merchant Francisco di Marco Dattini, pursued profit with a gusto that would be perfectly at home on Wall Street today. His life's motto, "In the name of God and of profit," appeared like a talisman on the first page of his business ledgers and was a quintessentially medieval marriage of the pious and the profane. But this single-minded drive for profit was still restricted to a relatively small class of merchant specialists. It did not serve as the founding principle of the economy as a whole. As will be illustrated over the course of this work, the principles of reciprocity and redistribution that shaped the contours of economic life remain vital, if unnoticed, in modern economies as well, each playing a central role in forms of economic activity embodying social values that are once again coming to prominence. Some readers may object that in describing this social immersion of economies in pre-industrial societies, I am idealizing pre-industrial life. This would misread my intention. Who would want to advocate a return to a time when, by almost any measure, life, life for the average individual was unimaginably harsher, shorter, and more precarious than what we know today? Rather, my purpose is to correct some received assumptions about the history and nature of economics as a body of thought and practice. I wish to stress that the splitting off and ascendance of economics over social values has not been the inevitable process that some would have us believe, and that the balance of social and spiritual values with those of commerce that was the feature of pre-industrial life is a matter of the utmost importance. The nurturing of the spiritual life is an inseparable from the cultivation of social and personal values that supersede those of commerce. I am arguing that the loss of this balance has cost humanity dearly. The great economic historian Karl Polanyi argued that the emergence of the market system we live in today required the devaluing of all those patterns of social organization that were embodied in the production and exchange of goods for motives other than personal gain. When all transactions that are turned into monetary transactions, all incomes must derive from the sale of something. It was precisely this reduction of all societal transactions to a commercial purpose that marks a radical break and discontinuity with everything that came before. For this to happen, people's motivation had to change from subsistence or mutual benefit or the welfare of society as a whole to the single motive of personal gain. For Polanyi, the conflation of the narrow market operations with the broader economy and social life as a whole was a direct consequence of reimagining society as an analog to the industrial process of machine production. In what can only be described as a mechanics of dehumanization, the essential elements for the sustenance of an organic human life, shared use of land, meaningful labor, and socially embedded personal identity were deprived of their social meaning and turned instead into commodities to supply the needs of an autonomous market system. As the nature of the market system evolved, so too did the manner in which these elements came to be manipulated. The insecurity and disorder of the times made the threat of hunger ever present and real. The mobilization of that threat by employers and their proponents in Parliament in order to induce the selling of one's labor at the lowest possible price was one of the most debased aspects of the transition to the market system. It also flowed from the callous political economy of the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus and became an operating assumption of classical economic theory thereafter. But there was also in this period a conscious and sustained effort to erase any semblance of the artisan's traditional independence. The transition from the artisan to worker entailed two tasks: the progressive elimination of skill and the internalization of those submissive attitudes that fitted the man to the discipline of the machine. The factory's demand for a fundamental transformation of human nature was stated explicitly by Dr. Andrew Urey, the Scottish chemist and inventor who became the preeminent theorist of the industrialization. In his truly satanic work, The Philosophy of Manufacturers, his truly diabolical work, Urey boldly states that the main difference of the factory system was not technological, but rather, quote, in training human beings to renounce their desultory habits of work and to identify themselves with the unvarying regularity of the complex automation of the factory. It is, in fact, the constant aim and tendency of every improvement in machinery to supersede human labor altogether, or to diminish its costs by substituting the industry of women and children for that of men, or that of ordinary laborers for trained artisans. Skill in this context was a threat to mindless efficiency. Thus, the manufacturers aimed at withdrawing any process that required peculiar dexterity and steadiness of hand from the cunning workman, and placing it in charge of a mechanism so self-regulating that a child may superintend it. To remake human character by internalizing attitudes that served the factory system, he enlisted the indoctrinating power of religion. Quote, it is excessively in the interest of every mill owner to organize his moral machinery on equally sound principles with his mechanical, for otherwise he will never command the steady hands, watchful eyes, and prompt cooperation essential to the excellence of product. There is, in fact, no case to which the gospel truth, quote, godliness is great gain, is more applicable than to the administration of the extensive factory. The malleability of human nature for selfish ends is an old and awful truth. Urey foresaw an explicit science of exploitation, but even he would have been left breathless at its final fruition of the dark arts of advertising in the latter part of the 20th century. Andrew Urey was a brilliant and malign force, exerting his influence on both Marx and Engels and the entire class of England's industrialists. And, in one of those happy coincidences that are literally impossible to invent, it turns out that our Dr. Urey was Mary Shelley's model for Victor Frankenstein. Of the three elements of pre-industrial economy, land, labor were the first to be subjugated to the demands of industry. The third, personal identity, was undermined at a theoretical level by utilitarian economic theory and then by the dehumanizing realities of landlessness, wage labor, destitution, and social alienation. But the individualization of identity remained only a precondition and a corollary for the creation of a market for labor. It took 2 centuries before the conditions were ripe for the ultimate manipulation of personal identity as a driver of consumption. Despite its enormous influence, largely outside economics, and its role in challenging the assertions of economic liberalism, Polanyi's thesis on the market and its relation to society has not been without its critics. His critique of market society and capitalism also led to the rejection of the market itself as a means of realizing democratic ideals. In this, I would argue, Polanyi failed to acknowledge the possibilities of his central premise. The economic system is, in effect, a mere function of social organization. This need not mean that an economic system derives solely from the state. Polanyi underestimates the generative power of civil society. The cooperative movement itself is evidence of this. And while the cooperative model parts company with capitalism, it remains firmly connected to the notion that the market can be made responsive to human needs without the need for a planned socialist economy, as Polanyi believed. Democracy and the market are not antithetical. Democracy and the market society in which the society principles are subordinated to the economic ones, as is the neoliberal doctrine of free markets, is another matter entirely. In our era, the horrors of the transition to market society are behind us. They have long receded from our consciousness, but they are painfully real to those millions who today are suffering through the same traumatic transition to the market systems now underway in China, Asia, Latin America, and eventually in every forgotten haven of the pre-industrialized world. Bitter, prolonged, often deadly struggles were fought over the social impacts of these ideas. And the real question that confronted market economies over the last 2 centuries, and the bedrock issue over which the social and economic battles have ultimately been fought, is how to limit the catastrophic damage of this free market model does to society, which ultimately had come to mean how and to what extent to constrain the power of capital. In the end, the free market worldview boils down to this: the claims of capital to be sovereign and the exercise of the field of economics of that despotic power that was only recently ceded in the field of politics. The exercise of democracy that laissez-faire capitalists now celebrate as good and holy in politics must be banned from economics. This is a rich terrain for irony, for while maintaining the principal authoritarian control of the markets and enterprises by capital in the economy, free market mythology also claims that free markets, and by extension capitalism, are the foundation of democracy. The claim is ludicrous, incoherent, and almost universally accepted. One reason is that there are certainly analogies between democratic values such as equity and dignity and a particular view of markets. Unlike closed caste systems where a person's status is determined at birth, markets can display features like openness, access of opportunity, and freedom of action that are the features of democratic systems. But markets do not and cannot guarantee equitable or dignified outcomes. The conflation of markets with democracy is a confusion at the most elementary level. It is the kind of mistake that can only be made, and this is being charitable, by the willfully ignorant. Capitalism is neither synonymous with the market nor is it the source of free and democratic societies. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of political history will know that democratic societies preceded capitalism and market societies by many centuries, commencing with the Greek city-states in the 4th century BCE and continuing up through the rise of civic humanism and the Italian democratic republics in the 14th century. The identification of free markets with democracy has become another element in the prolonged self-delusion of Americans who believe that the United States is the founding home of democracy, and this is not restricted to reflexive free markets some might wish. Sorry, and this is not restricted to the reflexive free markets some might wish to associate with a particular breed of Republicans. It is a pervasive conceit. On her first state visit to Europe as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who no one could claim as either ill-educated or stupid, was pleased to inform a stunned European Parliament that America's democracy, quote, has been around a lot longer than European democracy. The relation of the free market to democracy is more accurately the annexation and distortion of the democratic idea by the free market to by free market proponents as cover for the distinctly undemocratic economic realities of capitalist systems. I'm going to do that one again. The relation of the free market to democracy is more accurately the annexation and distortion of the democratic idea by free market proponents as a cover for the distinctly undemocratic economic realities of capitalist systems. The rise and rule of administrative bureaucracy was one of the first and the most characteristic features of a society based on the free market system. From the very beginning, the banner of utilitarianism had laissez-faire emblazoned on one side and state control for protection of property on the other. The patrician classes have always enlisted the power of government to advance their interests, and the fight for democracy has always been the struggle to break this nexus. Despite free market rhetoric to the contrary, this codependence of state control with the market system is one source of tension between democracy and capitalism. It is even more pronounced in state attempts to control the market with centralized command models, as was the case with Marxist brands of socialism. The alleged affinity for democracy on the part of economic liberalism is belied both in the historical record and in the everyday evidence presented by the conduct of its institutions. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the suppression of democracy in the marketplace. The freedom and equality that were achieved at such a cost in politics through the democratic revolutions have been steadily eroded by the pervasive and growing influence of corporate economic power. In any society, authoritarian power in economics ultimately trumps democratic power in politics. Therefore, the absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics. In truth, the human striving for equality and dignity that lay at the foundation of the democratic impulse was derailed to its extension in its extension to economics just when it was most needed, when the power of capital and the property owning classes were consolidated during the period of the Industrial Revolution. But there has never yet been a convincing answer to the question, if democracy is good for politics, why is it not equally good for economics? After all, the operations of the economy and the connection that people have with its institutions on a daily basis have a far more significant impact on the quality and conduct of their daily lives. We exercise our democratic right to vote for public officials once every 3 to 4 years. Yet we spend most of our waking hours in our workplaces, which are still run like dictatorships, day in, day out. And finally, we might ask, how is it that a free market is run along authoritarian systems of command and control and personified by tyrannical models of power if the individual and the individual firm? I'm going to read that again. And finally, we might ask, quote, how is it that a free market is run along authoritarian systems of command and control and personified by tyrannical models of power in the individual firm? It is a fundamental contradiction so elementary a child could see it, and one that free market mythology cannot resolve. If markets should be free, they must also be free in their constituent institutions. Admittedly, the democratic principles has found its fragile foothold in our economies, mostly through trade unions and sometimes in democratically controlled enterprises in the form of cooperatives. But even this was the result of bloody battles waged over decades with the captains of industry and their willing aides in government. From the very beginning, the establishment of free market systems and the transition from pre-industrial to industrial societies was accompanied by a brutal repression of democratic rights both at the political and economic level. The current claim that free markets are the source and guardians of democratic societies would be laughable if history didn't present such a dismal record showing exactly the opposite. The capitalist free market is not, and has never been, a friend to democracy. But the reverse is certainly true. It was free in democratic societies, and more particularly, free cities that generated conditions for which we have come to call free markets. A free market, in a proper sense, means essentially three things: a division of labor, the accumulation of wealth through economic development, and the freedom of enterprise. As Stefano Zamagini has so eloquently described it thus, the division of labor allows everyone to possibly work, even those less gifted, while allowing greater productivity through specialization. In practice, the division of labor obliges people to recognize their reciprocal ties. It underscores the reciprocity as an economic value, and it makes explicit the interdependence of specialized forms of work as components of a production process. It also enables those who are less gifted to contribute to the work of society, providing a fundamental component of self-worth. Development means the accumulation of wealth as a social good, not as a private end, but as a contingency against future misfortune and ultimately as a responsibility for future generations. Freedom of enterprise, according to Zamagini, means, quote, those endowed with creativity, a good propensity for risk, and the ability to coordinate the work of many others, the three essential qualities of the entrepreneur, must be left free to undertake initiatives without the need for prior authorization from a sovereign or underling, because the active and industrious life vita activa et negocia is a value in itself, not just a means to other ends. Sorry for butchering that. Freedom of enterprise is here understood as the freedom to engage in a productive and useful life in an open economy, one not controlled by a sovereign power, or in our day, a monopoly power. It does not entail the notion of an entrepreneur or a business may do what they please regardless of the effects of others. The Franciscans presented the idea of the free market in precisely these terms as early as the 15th century. All these conditions existed in the market economies that preceded capitalism. None of them presuppose the form that individual enterprises might take, whether privately owned firms or joint stock companies or democratically controlled cooperatives. It was in the city republics of Tuscany and Umbria between the 14th and 16th centuries that market economies first flourished in Europe, giving rise to the institutions of banking, notes of credit, joint stock company, an emerging class that, amongst other things, inaugurated the first truly global trading systems that in turn helped finance the Renaissance. It was only during the Industrial Revolution that the notion of profit maximization was added as a condition of market economies. This preeminence of profit really marked the transition from traditional market economies to capitalism. I dwell at some length on this economic history only to show that the notion of capitalism as being a precondition of free and democratic societies is a fallacy, although an article of faith of the free market creed. And if one were to look no further than the rise of capitalism in China and Russia, and the truly dispiriting spectacle of the state capitalism combining unfettered market development with the totalitarian power in the first case, and the consolidation of corrupt kleptocratic dynasty in the other. The one thing that emerges in this endless contest over economic ideas and values is that the nature of the nature of economics in general and the market in particular remains an open question, a continuously contested arena of claims and counterclaims. What is very clear is that the market and the larger notion of the economy of what it forms is a part of is in its nature a social and public concept. Let's try that again. What is very clear is that the market and the larger notion of the economy of which it forms a part of is in its nature a social and public concept. The notions that any one class can own the market or that the market has a nature organizational form such as the corporation are false. Has a natural organizational form such as the corporation are false. There we are. And despite the assumptions of free market faithful, the market does not belong to capital. The forms of enterprise that make it up and give it its vitality are varied as the uses to which they are put and values they embody. These values may be just as committed to social goods and ends as they are to commercial ones. Moreover, the forms that capitalism itself may take are astonishingly diverse. Free market doctrine makes it sound as if capitalism comes in just this one pure form. This is also false, and belies one of capitalism's singular strengths, its chameleon-like ability to adapt. There are many capitalisms, many ways that capital can mobilize and coordinate the process of the economic production. And I'm going to pause there. Partly because I'm parched, and partly because I've just read a bunch of pages, and also because I believe we've reached an hour and a half, and I feel like that is a good spot to end without someone else to carry on the conversation today. After all, very difficult to have a dialogue when it's only one of you. And at this point, I would just like to remind everybody that they are indeed awesome, and that I do look forward to when next our paths cross, and until that happens, I look forward to having discussions online, so please enjoy, please share with friends, especially if you're in the Grey Bruce area and you know somebody who has a business idea, but they themselves do not have enough money to get it off the ground. Let's get in touch, let's form a community network, let's do this, and let's make something that is a life worth living. You guys are all awesome. I'll talk to you later.